The deputy had just lifted my father's Purple Heart out of the walnut box when my husband said the sentence that ended our marriage. Curtis promised he would not file anything until after you retired. I was still wearing my army dress uniform. Less than 2 hours earlier, a major general at Fort Knox had pinned a retirement medal to my chest and thanked me for 33 years of service. Now I stood at the locked gate of Belridge Farm, staring at a court order that said I no longer owned the land where I had been born. Deputy Lena Brooks looked from Dale to me. Her hand stopped above the box. "Ma'am, did your husband just say he knew about this filing?" Dale's face had gone the color of old flour. He opened his mouth, but the only sound that came out was a dry breath. My daughter Hannah stood beside our car with one arm around her little girl. 6-year-old Rose still wore the red dress she had chosen for my ceremony. She kept looking at the new chain on the farm gate as though a grown-up might explain why someone had locked us out of our own family history. The walnut box had been hanging from that chain by a white cord. A brass plate on the lid read, "For Nora, now that you are finally coming home." Inside lay 4 things. The first was my father's Purple Heart, stolen from a steel safe in the farmhouse. The second was a certified copy of a deed claiming I had transferred all 212 acres to a company called Bell Ridge Development for $10. The third was a default judgment from county court. It said I had been properly notified, had failed to defend my ownership, and had not been in military service when the case was filed. I had been in Poland on active duty when it was filed. The fourth was a cashier's check made out to me for $100,000. A note was clipped to it in my brother's handwriting. "Take the money. Sign the release. Do not turn this into another war." My father used to say that paper was patient. It would sit quietly and let any fool write a lie on it. The army taught me the other half of that lesson. Paper also remembers. It remembers dates, signatures, serial numbers, access codes, and every hand that moved it from one place to another. I looked at Deputy Brooks. "Please do not put anything back the way you found it." Her expression changed. Until that moment, I think she had expected a bitter argument between relatives over an inheritance. Then she saw how I was studying the box. Not like a sister, not like a wife, like a property accountability officer, facing a broken chain of custody. She pulled on gloves. "No one touches the gate, the box, or the documents," she said. "Mr. Whitaker, step away from your wife." Dale obeyed. That hurt more than I expected. After 25 years of marriage, he moved away from me like a man relieved to receive a clear instruction. Deputy Brooks photographed the chain, the cord, the brass plate, and every item in the box. Then she asked who had called the sheriff. "My brother did," I said. "Curtis told dispatch an unstable former soldier was trespassing." "Former soldier," she repeated. I touched the new medal on my chest. Not yet. The ceremony was today. My official retirement date was the following Tuesday. She picked up the court order again. The paper claimed I had left active duty the previous December. The attached certificate even carried a convincing army seal. It was false, but it had been built by someone who knew exactly which details would make a clerk stop asking questions. Then Deputy Brooks turned over the Purple Heart presentation case. One of the backing screws was missing. A strip of fresh wood showed where someone had pried it open. Dale made a small sound. I looked at him. "What did you give them?" "Nothing." That answer came too fast. "What did you give them, Dale?" He stared at the gravel between his shoes. "The safe code," he whispered. "Marlene said Curtis needed the original farm insurance papers. She said the bank was going to call the note. My brother had taken my land, my father's medal, and my legal identity. My husband had handed him the key. Before I tell you why they needed me erased before the following Tuesday, tell me in the comments what you would have done first. Would you have confronted the family, or would you have treated every word, every envelope, and every frightened expression as evidence? I chose evidence. That decision saved the farm. It also exposed a debt large enough to ruin 3 people, a land deal tied to an army supplier, and a lie my brother had been telling about me for nearly 30 years. People later asked how I could spend 3 decades tracking Army equipment across oceans and still fail to see what my own family was doing a few counties away. The honest answer is simple. I never trusted a warehouse without an inventory. I trusted my brother without one. Belridge Farm sat outside Brandenburg, Kentucky, where the fields rolled down toward the Ohio River, and summer air smelled of cut hay, diesel fuel, and rain that had not arrived yet. My father, Amos Bell, bought the first 80 acres after coming home from Vietnam. He added land whenever a neighbor retired or a widow needed to sell. By the time I finished high school, the farm had grown to 212 acres, one white farmhouse, 2 barns, a machine shed, and a family cemetery beneath a line of cedar trees. Curtis was 3 years younger than I was. He loved tractors, cattle auctions, and being recognized at the feed store. I loved the farm too, but I also wanted to know what existed beyond the county line. When I was 25, after a failed office job and one difficult engagement I rarely talked about, I enlisted in the Army. My father drove me to the recruiting station before sunrise. Curtis stayed home. At the bus station, Dad handed me a green pocket notebook. The cover was stiff and ugly, the kind of notebook no one would steal. Write down what matters, he said. Memory gets proud. Ink stays honest. I carried that habit through basic training, warrant officer school, 3 deployments, and more inspections than I could count. I wrote down dates, names, promises, and anything that did not sound right the first time. Soldiers teased me about it until one of my notebooks found a missing shipment of vehicle parts in Kuwait. After that, they called it Chief's second brain. My specialty was property, accountability, and sustainment. That meant I spent my career making sure the Army knew what it owned, where it was, who had signed for it, and what happened when something disappeared. I was not a detective. I did not kick down doors. I followed hand receipts, shipping records, maintenance logs, and the small human shortcuts that usually caused large, expensive problems. Curtis used to joke that I counted wrenches for a living. I used to laugh. While I moved from post to post, he remained at Belridge. He married Marlene, who worked her way from receptionist to senior escrow officer at a regional title company. They had one son, Evan, and built a brick house on 20 acres Dad had given Curtis near the south pasture. From the outside, Curtis looked like the loyal child who stayed. I looked like the daughter who left. That was the story he told. Anyway, the part he left out was money. The farm nearly failed during the late 90s. Cattle prices dropped, Dad needed heart surgery, and the bank threatened foreclosure. I began sending part of every paycheck home. At first, it was $300 a month. Later, it was $500. During deployments, when I had fewer expenses, I sent more. I paid property taxes twice when Curtis said the operating account was empty. I covered a new well pump, a roof, and most of Dad's rehabilitation after his second stroke. I never asked for public credit. I thought that was what family did. Curtis accepted every transfer and kept telling people I had abandoned the place. Dale knew the truth. I met him at Fort Hood when I was 31. He repaired heavy diesel engines for a civilian contractor and could identify a bad injector by sound. He was patient, funny in a quiet way, and good with Hannah, who was 6 when we met. Her biological father had not stayed involved, and Dale never treated her like borrowed family. We married 2 years later. For a long time, he was the safest person I knew. Dale also hated conflict. At first, I mistook that for calm. Whenever Curtis made a cutting remark, Dale would wait until we were in the truck and say, "You know how he is." Whenever Marlene asked questions about Dad's will, Dale would say, "She works in real estate. Paperwork is how she thinks." Whenever Curtis complained that I came home wearing rank on my shoulders, Dale would tell me not to turn supper into a command meeting. I was not trying to command anyone. I was asking not to be insulted in my father's house. But peace can become a bad habit. The more I swallowed, the less anyone else had to change. Marlene was never loud. That made her harder to read. She spoke gently, dressed neatly, and carried a black leather folder everywhere. She could make an accusation sound like a clerical question. Do you really want land in Kentucky when the army could move you again? Should Curtis receive something for all those years of unpaid labor? Would it not be cleaner to let one household hold title? If I objected, she smiled. Paperwork is just paper, Nora. No need to make it personal. Dad did make it personal when he changed the deed. 7 years before he died, he asked me to meet him at a lawyer's office in Elizabethtown. Curtis was already there, red-faced and silent. Marlene sat beside him with her black folder closed on her lap. Dad transferred Bell Ridge Farm to me. Not because he loved Curtis less, not because I wore a uniform. He did it because I had paid enough of the mortgage and taxes to prevent the land from being lost, and because Curtis had borrowed against farm income without telling him. The deed gave Curtis a long-term residence lease on his house and a renewable management agreement for the farm operation. He could earn a living there. He could not sell, mortgage, or transfer the land. Curtis called it a humiliation. Dad called it an inventory. Someone has to know what belongs to whom, he said. I offered Curtis half the net farm income and full use of equipment under the management agreement. I also promised not to sell while Dad was alive. Curtis signed, but he did not forgive me. Afterward, Dale asked why I had not let the brothers work it out. There were no brothers, I reminded him. He gave me an embarrassed smile. You know what I mean. Yes, I did. He meant I should make myself smaller so Curtis would feel larger. Dad died in the spring after his 76th birthday. The funeral was held beneath a hard blue sky. An honor guard folded the flag. Curtis cried into both hands. I believed grief might soften what pride had hardened. For a while, it seemed to. We agreed Curtis would continue managing Bell Ridge. I was still active duty, and the arrangement made practical sense. He sent quarterly summaries. I reviewed them, asked a few questions, and approved repairs. The farm did not make much profit, but it held its own. Dad's Purple Heart remained in a steel safe in the farmhouse study. I had the legal title. Curtis had a management key. Dale and I had the safe code. Marlene did not. At least, that was what I believed. The first serious warning came 4 years later, when Evan brought a drone to Thanksgiving dinner. He set it on the dining room table between the turkey and the sweet potatoes as if it were another serving dish. He had started an aerial mapping company called Ridgeline Survey Works. He talked about agricultural imaging, construction planning, and government contracts. Then he unfolded a color map of Bell Ridge Farm. The property was divided into blue grids. A wide yellow rectangle covered the south pasture, the machine shed, and the road frontage. What is that? I asked. Evan looked at Curtis before answering. Just a demonstration. A demonstration for whom? Curtis reached for the gravy. Do not interrogate the boy, Nora. I folded the map and slid it toward me. I am not interrogating him. I am asking why someone mapped land they do not own. Marlene gave her small, patient smile. Paperwork is just paper. A map is just a picture. I should have opened my green notebook that night. Instead, I let Dale touch my knee beneath the table and whisper, let it go until after the holiday. So, I did. That was the last Thanksgiving before they began turning the picture into a plan. The following January, I left for a 5-month rotation in Poland. It was not a combat deployment. My team was helping untangle a sustainment problem involving repair parts, rail movements, and equipment that had crossed too many borders with too little documentation. At my age and rank, most of my work happened under fluorescent lights, with cold coffee beside a laptop. It was still active duty. It still put an ocean between me and Kentucky. Before I left, I signed a limited power of attorney for Dale. It allowed him to pay Bell Ridge property taxes, renew insurance, and sign one farm equipment registration if the document arrived while I was gone. The authority expired at the end of June. The first page named the 3 permitted actions. The second page carried my signature and the notary acknowledgement. I scanned the complete document into my records and wrote the expiration date in my green notebook. Dale watched me label the file. You know, most people just put important papers in a drawer, he said. Most people have never spent 6 weeks finding a generator that was sitting behind the building where the paperwork said it could not possibly be. He laughed and kissed my forehead. That memory bothered me later. Betrayal would be easier to carry if every good moment before it had been false. Ours were not false. Dale loved me. He simply loved avoiding discomfort more. The first month overseas was busy enough that I did not think much about the farm. Curtis sent his usual report. Feed costs were up. A tractor needed hydraulic work. Evan had found 2 possible commercial clients for his drone business. Then Marlene emailed me. She said the county needed a fresh copy of my deed for a drainage application. She asked for my driver's license, my military identification, and the power of attorney. I sent the deed. I did not send the identification or the power of attorney. A drainage application does not require my military identification, I wrote. She replied within 3 minutes. Of course, I was only trying to save everyone time. 2 days later, Dale called from his repair shop. His voice had that careful tone he used when he wanted an answer without an argument. Curtis says the farm line of credit is in trouble. Bell Ridge did not have a line of credit in my name. He says it is an operating note. How much? I do not know. Who signed it? Nora. I am calling because he is worried. That sentence irritated me. It turned my request for facts into a personality flaw. Tell Curtis to send the note, the payment history, and the lender contact. I will review it. He never did. In March, a certified letter was mailed to an apartment in Killeen, Texas, where Hannah and I had lived more than 20 years earlier. I did not know about it then. No one at that address knew me. The envelope was returned after 3 delivery attempts. A week later, someone published a legal notice in a county newspaper I had not read since high school. While I was reviewing rail manifests in Poland, Bell Ridge Development filed a lawsuit claiming it owned my farm through a deed I had never signed. The company listed Curtis as manager and Marlene as authorized representative. They asked the court to confirm their title because the original owner, meaning me, had failed to honor a private transfer agreement. They told the court they could not find me. My brother had my Army email address, my personal email address, my phone number, my daughter's phone number, and the mailing address printed on every quarterly farm report. He told the court he could not find me. Near the end of March, Marlene signed a sworn statement saying she had made a diligent inquiry and had no reason to believe I was in military service. Attached to that statement was a retirement certificate showing I had left active duty the previous December. The certificate was a forgery. The date was not random. The previous December was when my command had prepared an early draft of my retirement packet. Only 4 people outside the Army knew I was considering that month: Curtis, Marlene, Hannah, and Dale. Because the court was told I was not serving and because I never appeared, Bell Ridge Development obtained a default judgment in April. I was still in Poland. At the time, the only clue I noticed was a strange question from Dale during a Sunday video call. When does your active duty status legally end? He asked. My ceremony is in September. My official retirement date is the first day of October. So the ceremony itself does not change anything? No. Why? He rubbed the back of his neck. Curtis was wondering when you would have more time for farm decisions. Tell Curtis I have time now if he sends documents. Dale nodded and changed the subject. I wrote the question in my green notebook. Then a colonel walked into the office with a shipment problem, and I did not return to the entry for weeks. By May, I was preparing to leave Poland. Evan emailed me a link to an online folder containing aerial photographs of Bell Ridge. He said he had completed a free soil survey as a retirement gift. The images were too detailed for a gift. They showed property boundaries, utility access, road grades, drainage routes, and the distance from the south pasture to the nearest highway interchange. One page included a wind direction chart. Another marked the county water line. I called him. Who commissioned this? No one. I told you. I am building my portfolio. Then why does the file name say Aegis Site 4? He went quiet. It is just how I organize projects. What is Aegis? A placeholder. For what? Aunt Nora, I have another call. He hung up. I forwarded the folder to my personal archive. When I checked the link the next morning, it had been deleted. That was the moment I finally opened my notebook and drew a line beneath 4 entries. The missing loan documents. Marlene's request for identification. Dale's question about my legal retirement date. Ages Site 4. I called Curtis and told him I wanted a full accounting before my ceremony. He laughed. You have been gone 30 years and suddenly you want to count fence posts. I own the fence posts. There it is, he said. That army voice. No, this is the owner voice. Send the records. He sent nothing. When I returned to Kentucky in June, Bell Ridge looked normal from the county road. The corn was high. The cattle were healthy. The white farmhouse needed paint, but it had needed paint for 10 years. Then I noticed 3 orange survey stakes near the south gate. Curtis said the electric cooperative had placed them. The cooperative told me it had not. Marlene said Evan must have forgotten to remove them. Evan stopped answering my calls. Dale told me everyone was tense because retirement represented a change. You are going to have more time, he said. Curtis thinks you will come in and take over everything. I do not want to take over. I want accurate records. Sometimes those sound the same coming from you. That sentence stayed with me, not because it was fair, because it sounded borrowed. During my last weeks in uniform, Curtis and Marlene declined every invitation to the retirement ceremony. Curtis blamed harvest. Marlene said title offices were busiest at the end of the month. Evan never responded. Dale said not to take it personally. Hannah did. Mom, she said, people make time for the things they respect. I remembered my father saying something similar about money. A budget always reveals what a person truly values. The morning of my ceremony, Dale left the house before I did. He said he needed to help Curtis move a disabled tractor from the south field. He arrived at Fort Knox 20 minutes before the program began. There was mud on his shoes and a fresh cut across his right palm. What happened? I asked. Sheet metal at the shop. He would not meet my eyes. 3 hours later, at the locked gate of Bell Ridge Farm, Deputy Brooks found a thin smear of blood on the new chain. Deputy Brooks collected the blood from the chain before she asked Dale about the cut on his hand. He said he had already explained it. Not to me, she replied. There was no anger in her voice, just the flat patience of someone who had heard better lies before breakfast. Curtis arrived in his pickup 10 minutes later. He wore a clean work shirt and carried a folder under one arm. Marlene sat beside him. Neither of them looked surprised to see the deputy. That told me the lockout had not been an emotional decision. It had been scheduled. Curtis climbed out and pointed at me. She has no right to be here. Deputy Brooks looked at the medal on my uniform, then at the court papers in her evidence bag. Mr. Bell, did you place the walnut box on the gate? My attorney advised me not to discuss private settlement terms. You called the sheriff to report trespassing. Because this property belongs to Bell Ridge Development, I stepped forward. Show me the operating agreement for that company. Curtis gave me the smile he had used since childhood whenever he believed he had finally won. You do not give orders here anymore. Marlene touched his arm. Let the process work. The process, I said, has my forged signature on it. Her eyes moved toward Dale for less than a second. Deputy Brooks saw it too. She instructed all of us to remain outside the gate while she called her supervisor and the county prosecutor. Then she asked whether anyone could verify where the Purple Heart had been stored. Hannah raised her hand as if she were back in school. I saw it in the farmhouse safe 3 weeks ago. My daughter wanted to hear about her great-grandfather. Who opened the safe? My mother. Who knew the code? Mom and Dale. Curtis interrupted. I had access as farm manager. To the building, I said. Not to the safe. Deputy Brooks asked Curtis for permission to inspect the farmhouse study. He refused. She nodded as though she had expected that answer. Then Marlene made her first mistake. There is no reason to search for the medal, she said. It was not stolen. Amos intended Curtis to have it. No one had accused her of stealing it. Not yet. Deputy Brooks turned toward her. How did you know the medal came from inside the safe? Marlene's mouth tightened. Everyone knew where Amos kept it. Hannah shook her head. No, everyone did not. The deputy wrote that down. A supervisor arrived, followed by an investigator from the county prosecutor's office. After reviewing the box and speaking with us separately, they told Curtis the gate would remain undisturbed until a judge decided possession. Curtis became loud. Marlene became very quiet. I called Fort Knox legal assistance from the side of the road. Major Benjamin Soto had helped review my retirement documents 2 months earlier. He listened without interrupting while I described the deed, the default judgment, and the false statement about my military status. When I finished, he asked one question. Were you on active duty when the lawsuit was filed and when judgment was entered? Yes. I was overseas for both. Then this is not only a property dispute, Chief. He told me about the federal law that protects service members who cannot appear in civil cases because of military duty. Before a court enters a default judgment, the person seeking judgment must tell the court whether the absent defendant is in military service and provide facts supporting that statement. If the defendant is serving, the court may have to appoint an attorney and pause the case long enough for a real defense. What happens if the affidavit is knowingly false? I asked. It can be a crime. More important for today, it gives your civilian attorney a direct path to ask the court to reopen the judgment. A recording stamp does not cleanse a forged deed, and a default order built on false service does not become sacred because someone printed it on heavy paper. That was the most comforting sentence I heard all day. Major Soto connected me with Ruth Harlan, a civilian lawyer in Louisville who handled land fraud and military relief cases. Ruth was 62, silver-haired, and so direct that she made me sound diplomatic. She met us at the county courthouse before the clerk's office closed. Dale came with me. I did not invite him. He followed in his truck and waited near the entrance until Hannah told him that waiting outside would not make him innocent. Inside, Circuit Clerk Pauline Mercer pulled the file. She had worked at the courthouse for more than 40 years and remembered my father. Amos used to bring us tomatoes every August, she said. Then she saw the plaintiff's name and stopped smiling. Bell Ridge Development had filed the case in early March. The complaint included the forged deed. Service had been attempted at my old address in Texas. After the envelope came back, Curtis's attorney requested service through publication. Marlene submitted the military status affidavit. The court entered default in April. Ruth read every page twice. Where is the search certificate? She asked. Pauline turned to a computer screen. There is not one attached. A proper military status search could have confirmed my active duty in minutes. Instead, Marlene had submitted the fake retirement certificate and sworn that I was not serving. Ruth looked at Dale. Who had access to a draft retirement certificate? He gripped the edge of the counter. I did. Did you give it to Marlene? She asked for a copy of Nora's retirement program. She said the family wanted to make a surprise album. The ceremony program did not contain a retirement certificate. No, he whispered. What exactly did you send? A folder from our home computer. I thought it was photographs and old orders. I knew the folder. It contained scanned copies of my awards, promotion orders, passport, limited power of attorney, and the draft retirement packet. Why would you send that entire folder? I asked. Curtis said Evan needed material for a tribute video. There had been no tribute video. Ruth requested certified copies of the full court file and asked Pauline to preserve the electronic filing records, including upload times, account names, and internet addresses. Then she prepared an emergency motion to set aside the default judgment and stop any transfer of the farm. While she worked, I reviewed the forged deed. The signature looked close to mine, but the final stroke in my last name curved upward. I had not finished a signature that way since my 20s. The notary acknowledgement belonged to Marlene. The date fell on a Tuesday when I had been in a secure conference in Poland. The deed said I had appeared before Marlene in person in Kentucky. My travel orders and passport showed otherwise. Then I noticed something else. The document described the farm using language from Dad's old deed, but one boundary line had been updated to include a narrow strip near the highway. That strip had been purchased only 2 years earlier. The updated description came from a survey stored in the farmhouse safe. They had not merely copied public records. Someone had opened the safe, removed the private survey, taken the Purple Heart, and likely photographed everything else inside. Dale sat across from me in the courthouse hallway. I did not know they were doing this, he said. You knew they were doing something. I knew Curtis needed a loan. You gave him my safe code. He said the original insurance policy was inside. You gave Marlene my private computer folder for a retirement project. You heard yourself say that, did you not? His face crumpled. I wanted to help without starting another fight. That was when I understood the real shape of his betrayal. Dale had not joined the conspiracy because he wanted my farm. He had opened every door because each lie offered him a way to avoid one difficult conversation. Ruth returned carrying the emergency papers. The judge will hear us first thing Monday, she said. I am also notifying the title insurer and every closing agent named in this file. No one should be able to move the property before then. Monday, I repeated. The note in the walnut box had ordered me to sign a release before Tuesday. Ruth saw my expression. What is it? They have a deadline. For the first time that day, I felt something colder than anger. People forge signatures because they want property. They obtain rushed default judgments because they want time. My family needed both. The question was no longer whether Curtis had tried to steal Bell Ridge. The question was who was waiting to buy it on Tuesday morning. We found Aegis before midnight. Hannah searched the company name from Evan's deleted file while Ruth contacted a title insurer. Aegis Rotor Systems was an aviation supplier planning a new assembly and testing facility somewhere in central Kentucky. The company made guidance components and battery housings for unmanned aircraft used by commercial operators and defense contractors. A press release said the site would require road access, open land, reliable power, and room for a controlled flight corridor. Bell Ridge had all four. The South Pasture sat less than 12 miles from Fort Knox and less than 6 miles from an interstate interchange. The county water line ran along our frontage. A high-voltage transmission corridor crossed the far edge of the property. What I had always seen as hay ground, Evan had mapped as infrastructure. On Saturday morning, Deputy Brooks called. A judge had approved a search warrant for the farmhouse study and farm office based on the stolen metal, the blood on the chain, and the forged documents. Curtis had spent the night insisting the Purple Heart belonged to him. Marlene had stopped answering questions. I was allowed to watch from outside the farmhouse while investigators entered. The front porch looked exactly as it had when Dad was alive. His old metal chair sat near the door. A coffee can full of rusted bolts remained beneath the window. Grief can make a place feel preserved even while someone is dismantling it behind the walls. The safe door showed fresh scratches around the lock. Dale's code had opened it. Investigators found the original survey, insurance policy, and management agreement on Curtis's desk instead of inside the safe. They also found a portable scanner, Marlene's black folder, and a stack of practice signatures on yellow legal paper. My name appeared 47 times. Some attempts looked childish. Others were close enough to pass a hurried glance. Deputy Brooks carried out a laptop and 3 cardboard file boxes. The last box contained documents marked Aegis Site 4. Ruth and I reviewed copies at the prosecutor's office that afternoon. The first document was an option agreement. Aegis Rotor Systems had agreed to buy 160 acres of Bell Ridge for $4,800,000, subject to clean title and local approvals. The closing deadline was the first day of October, my official retirement date. The second document was a funding agreement from a private lender. Curtis had received $640,000 in advance against the expected sale. He had represented that Bell Ridge Development owned the land, free of competing claims. If the sale failed because his representation was false, the agreement required repayment of twice the advance, $1,280,000. That was the panic mechanism. Curtis did not need my farm someday. He needed clean title by Tuesday morning, or a lender would discover that he had pledged land he did not own. The bank records showed where the advance had gone. $290,000 covered old farm debts and delinquent equipment loans. $235,000 went to Evans Drone Company for aircraft, software, and a leased office. The remaining money paid personal credit cards, Marlene's home equity arrears, and a deposit on a condominium near Louisville. They had spent almost all of it. The next folder explained the timing. Marlene had created a calendar that tracked my deployment, return date, terminal leave, ceremony, and official retirement. Beside the first day of October, she had written, "Protection ends. Close at 9. She was wrong about the law. Some protections continue after service, and a false affidavit does not become true when a uniform comes off. But her mistake told us what she believed. They had used my service to keep me away. Then they planned to use my retirement to convince everyone I had lost the right to challenge them." Deputy Brooks opened another evidence bag. Inside was Dad's old green farm ledger. I recognized it immediately. He kept it in the bottom drawer of his desk and wrote with a blue ballpoint pen that left dents through 3 pages. For years, Curtis had told neighbors that he alone supported Bell Ridge, while I traveled the world at government expense. Dad's ledger told a different story. Every transfer I sent home was recorded by date. Mortgage payment from Nora, property tax from Nora, hospital bill from Nora, roof materials from Nora. At the bottom of one page, Dad had written a total $214,700, the amount I had quietly put into the farm before he transferred title to me. Beneath the total, he had added a sentence. "Curtis works the ground. Nora keeps it ours. Do not confuse visibility with sacrifice." I had to stop reading. Hannah put her hand over mine. I had spent years telling myself I did not need public credit. That was mostly true. But seeing Dad's words reminded me how thoroughly Curtis had rewritten our history. He had not only tried to take land, he had built the moral excuse first. In his version, I was an absent sister returning with rank and legal papers to claim what he had earned. A lie becomes useful when enough people repeat it politely. Dale had repeated it every time he told me to let Curtis feel respected. The investigators found one more item in the farm office. It was a small digital voice recorder Dad used after his stroke when writing became difficult. Most files were farm notes, calving dates, fuel orders, reminders to call the veterinarian. One recording had been made the day after he signed the deed to me. Deputy Brooks played it through a computer speaker. Dad's voice sounded weak but clear. "Curtis is angry. I understand anger. But a farm is not a prize for staying where you started. Nora paid when nobody saw. She came home every time it counted. I put the deed where the responsibility already was." The recording ended with the click of a button. No one in the room spoke for a while. Then Dale began to cry. I did not comfort him. By Sunday afternoon, the title company had suspended Marlene. Its internal security team preserved her computer, email, print logs, and access records. The county prosecutor obtained another warrant. The computer evidence was worse than the paper. Marlene had saved the forged deed under the file name Nora Transfer Final. A previous version was called Nora Transfer Dale Copy. The metadata showed that someone using our home computer had opened the document 2 weeks before it was recorded. Dale said he had never seen it. The investigator asked whether anyone else used his computer account. He admitted Curtis had spent an evening at our house while I was in Poland. Dale had gone to bed early. Curtis said he needed the printer. "Did you leave him alone in the office?" the investigator asked. "Yes." "Was Nora's scanned signature folder accessible?" "Yes." "Did you know Marlene was preparing a deed?" Dale looked at me before answering. "I knew they were preparing something to secure the Aegis money. The room seemed to narrow." "You knew about Aegis?" I said. He nodded. "Since when?" "Thanksgiving." The drone map had been on the table. I had asked who commissioned it. Evan had lied. Curtis had mocked me. Marlene had smiled. Dale had touched my knee and told me to let it go. He already knew. Why? I asked. "Curtis said the deal would save the farm. He said you would refuse before hearing the numbers because you would think selling meant betraying your father. He said once the debts were paid, you would receive most of the money. Most of my own money." He flinched. "I thought they only needed temporary control to prove site access. I did not know they would forge your name. When did you learn?" His silence answered before he did. "The week before your ceremony." And you said nothing. He told me the court had already approved it. He said fighting would cost everyone the farm and Evan could go to prison for the loan papers. He promised they would offer you a settlement. The cashier's check in the walnut box, $100,000 out of a sale worth $4,800,000. Dale had known enough to warn me. Instead, he helped them place a price on my silence. I removed my wedding ring and set it on the conference table. He stared at it. Nora, please, you keep saying you did not know the worst part. That is not a defense. You knew enough to ask no more questions. I did not want to lose our family. I looked at Dad's ledger, the forged deed, and the photograph of his medal hanging from a chain on my own gate. You did not protect the family, Dale. You protected the moment before the family became angry with you. Deputy Brooks stepped outside to give us privacy. I did not need privacy. I needed a boundary that could not be negotiated while I was tired. Do not come home tonight, I said. Do not call Hannah to speak for you. Do not contact Curtis or Marlene. If investigators ask for your phone, give it to them. He whispered my name again. I had heard it as a plea for 25 years. That afternoon, it sounded like another request that I carry the consequence for him. I left the ring on the table. Monday morning, we went to court to stop the closing. The civil hearing began at 8:30 on Monday morning. Judge Miriam Holloway had already reviewed Ruth's emergency motion, my deployment orders, the forged retirement certificate, and the court file. Curtis sat with a lawyer from Louisville. Marlene sat behind him, wearing a gray suit and the expression of a woman inconvenienced by other people's emotions. Dale remained across the aisle under subpoena from the county prosecutor. A representative from Aegis Rotor Systems attended with 2 attorneys. So did a title insurer, the private lender, and 3 local reporters who had learned that a defense supplier's land purchase had been frozen by an Army retiree claiming fraud. Judge Holloway began with the simplest question. Mrs. Bell, what facts supported your sworn statement that Chief Warrant Officer Whitaker was not in military service? Marlene's lawyer stood. My client relied on family information and a retirement document. The judge held up the forged certificate. This document says Chief Whitaker retired in December. Her official Army record says she was deployed overseas until May and remains on active duty through the end of this month. Who provided the document? Marlene looked at Curtis. Curtis looked at Dale. Dale looked at the floor. Ruth did not need to dramatize the silence. She called Pauline Mercer, the circuit clerk, who explained that no military status search had been attached to the affidavit. She confirmed that the only direct service attempt went to an address more than 20 years old. She also confirmed that the plaintiff's filing listed my current telephone number in an exhibit. They told the court they could not locate me while submitting a page that showed exactly how to call me. Next, Major Soto testified only about my active duty status and the legal assistance records showing I had been overseas. He did not argue the civil case. He did not need to. Ruth then presented my passport, travel orders, unit records, and a photograph of me standing in Poland on the date the deed claimed I had appeared before Marlene in Kentucky. Marlene watched the photograph appear on the courtroom screen. For the first time, her careful expression cracked. Judge Holloway asked whether Bell Ridge Development wished to contest that the deed was forged. Curtis's lawyer requested time for forensic review. The judge gave him the same look my first sergeant used to give soldiers who requested more time after spending a month avoiding a task. You had nearly 7 months to verify your own document, counsel. She vacated the default judgment, restored the prior title status, and issued an order blocking any sale, mortgage, transfer, or alteration of Bell Ridge until the fraud claims were resolved. She also referred the false military affidavit to state and federal authorities. Then she addressed the Aegis attorneys. Your client does not have a valid seller. The lead attorney stood. Understood, Your Honor. Curtis turned around so quickly, his chair struck the rail. You cannot do this, he said. The closing is tomorrow. Judge Holloway looked directly at him. Mr. Bell, the existence of your deadline does not create ownership. That sentence ended the land deal. It did not end the case. Outside the courthouse, Curtis pushed through reporters and accused me of using military connections to steal his life's work. By noon, he had posted a long message online. Some people leave home, collect medals, and return believing the rest of us are employees. I spent 30 years keeping Belridge alive while my sister built a career somewhere else. Now she wants sympathy because our family found a way forward without her permission. The post spread through the county. People who had seen him at livestock auctions believed him. Others remembered Dad's funeral and assumed the land had always belonged to Curtis. A local radio host called it a sad inheritance dispute between a decorated soldier and the brother who stayed behind. For one afternoon, Curtis nearly regained control of the story. Then Hannah posted one photograph. It showed a page from Dad's ledger. My payments filled the lines. His sentence about visibility and sacrifice appeared at the bottom. She wrote only this: staying visible is not the same as carrying the cost. I asked her to remove the dollar amounts because I did not want a public trial before the legal one. She did. But the damage to Curtis's story was done. The Aegis deal collapsed. The private lender demanded repayment. Evans' drone company shut its office. The title company fired Marlene and reported her notary conduct to the state. Curtis's cattle accounts were frozen after the lender alleged fraud. 3 days later, investigators arrested Curtis and Marlene on state charges involving forgery, identity theft, perjury, and conspiracy. Evans surrendered the following morning with an attorney. Dale was not arrested. The prosecutor said his conduct was under review. He had supplied access, information, and silence, but the available evidence did not show that he created the forged documents or received the money. That distinction mattered legally. It did not repair our marriage. Dale moved into a small apartment above his repair shop. He left messages on my phone every evening for 2 weeks. I listened to the first 3. In one, he apologized. In another, he explained. In the third, he said Curtis had manipulated him. I stopped listening after that. Manipulation can explain why a person feels confused. It does not explain why he hides a court judgment from his wife for a week and drives her to a retirement ceremony while her family prepares to lock her out. Ruth filed a civil action to clear every fraudulent document from the title record and recover legal costs. The prosecutor built the criminal case. Investigators copied phones, bank accounts, emails, and printer logs. My own role was smaller than people expected. I made a timeline. I placed every call, message, transfer, court filing, and access event in order. I matched the blood on the gate to Dale's cut, not because I thought he had hung the box, but because time mattered. His phone showed he had met Curtis at the farm that morning. Dale admitted helping install the chain. He said he believed the box contained a settlement offer, not Dad's metal. That admission finally answered the first question from the gate. He had not discovered the plan when Deputy Brooks opened the box. He had helped prepare the scene and hoped the contents would be less cruel than the people who packed them. Evan accepted a cooperation agreement in December. His attorney delivered a laptop backup that contained messages Curtis and Marlene had deleted. One message from Curtis read, "She will be overseas when we file. By the time she comes back, the judge will have done the hard part." Another read, "Once the ceremony is over, she will think the army cannot help her." The last message was sent to Dale the night before my retirement. "Keep Nora calm until Tuesday. After closing, we can all breathe." Dale had replied with one word, "Understood." When Ruth showed me that message, the remaining uncertainty disappeared. He had not understood every document. He had understood the objective. In January, I filed for divorce. In March, the criminal trial began. The criminal trial lasted 6 days. I had spent most of my adult life in rooms where people were expected to speak in sequence and support claims with records. A courtroom felt familiar in that narrow sense. What felt unfamiliar was hearing my family described as defendants, co-conspirators, witnesses, and victims. Curtis wore a dark blue suit that did not fit across his shoulders. Marlene wore pearls and kept her black folder on the defense table even though it contained only blank paper. I wondered whether she carried it from habit or superstition. The prosecutor did not begin with the Purple Heart or the angry note. She began with dates. On the courtroom screen, she placed my deployment timeline beside the forged deed, the military affidavit, and the default judgment. When the deed said I appeared in Kentucky, I was in Poland. When Marlene swore I was not serving, I was briefing an Army sustainment command. When Curtis told the court he could not locate me, he had exchanged text messages with me that same week. The first layer was not emotional. It was arithmetic. Pauline Mercer testified about the court file. She explained that the plaintiff seeking default had a duty to address military status accurately. She showed the jury the false affidavit and the missing search certificate. Curtis's lawyer asked whether clerks independently verify every statement filed with the court. No, Pauline said. We receive sworn documents. The system depends on people understanding that sworn does not mean optional. Major Soto followed. He explained the federal protection in ordinary language. If a service member does not appear in a civil case, the court must be told the truth about military status. When active service may prevent a defense, the law can require counsel and time before judgment. The prosecutor asked why the rule existed. Because military duty should not become an invitation to take someone's home while that person is serving elsewhere. That was the legal fact the jury remembered. The second layer came from a forensic document examiner. She compared the deed signature with dozens of genuine samples from different periods of my life. The forged signature had been built from an old scan. It matched the upward final stroke I used in the early 90s, not the flatter stroke I had used for more than 20 years. She also found tiny compression marks beneath the ink. Someone had practiced by tracing a printout on top of other pages. The yellow legal pad recovered from Curtis's office carried those same marks. Marlene's lawyer argued that spouses and relatives often possess signature samples for innocent reasons. The examiner agreed. Then the prosecutor displayed the file history from Marlene's computer. Nora transfer draft. Nora transfer Dale copy. Nora transfer final. Each revision moved closer to my genuine signature. The third layer was money. An Aegis executive testified that Curtis had represented himself as authorized owner of Bell Ridge. A private lender then explained the advance and the double repayment clause. The prosecutor placed the bank transfers on screen. Farm debts, drone equipment, credit cards, the condominium deposit. Curtis had already spent the money and had no realistic way to repay it if the sale failed. His lawyer called the arrangement a desperate attempt to preserve a family business. The lender answered with one sentence: preserving a business does not require lying about who owns the collateral. The fourth layer was Evan. He walked to the witness stand looking much younger than 30. He had pleaded guilty to lesser charges and agreed to cooperate. His voice shook when he described mapping Bell Ridge for Aegis and creating false site control exhibits. Who told you your aunt had approved the sale? The prosecutor asked. My father. When did you learn she had not? At Thanksgiving, when she asked why I mapped the farm. Why did you continue? Evan looked at me for the first time. Because Dad said the court papers would make her approval unnecessary. He testified that Marlene built the forged deed. Curtis supplied the old address and the story that I had abandoned the land. Dale supplied the safe code and the computer folder. Evan supplied maps designed to make Aegis believe title was already settled. Then the prosecutor showed him the deleted message about filing while I was overseas. What did your father mean by the judge doing the hard part? Evan swallowed. He meant Aunt Nora would look unreasonable if she challenged a court order after the sale. He said people trust a judge's stamp more than a woman's anger. Marlene closed her eyes. Curtis stared at his son with a face I had seen only once before, when Dad transferred the deed to me. It was not grief. It was the shock of losing control over the family version of events. The fifth layer was Dale. He entered under subpoena and sat with both hands folded tightly in his lap. He admitted giving Marlene the computer folder. He admitted sharing the safe code. He admitted helping Curtis hang the new chain on the gate the morning of my ceremony. Curtis's lawyer asked whether Dale had ever heard Curtis say he intended to steal the farm. Not in those words, Dale said. Did you believe Nora would receive money from the sale? Yes. Did you believe Curtis wanted to save Bell Ridge from debt? Yes. For a moment, the defense seemed almost relieved. Then the prosecutor displayed Dale's reply to the message, telling him to keep me calm until closing. Understood. What did you understand? She asked. Dale looked at me. That Nora did not know. That she would stop it if she found out. That they needed me to keep her from asking questions until the land was gone. The courtroom became very quiet. Why did you agree? His answer came slowly. Because I had spent so many years keeping everyone calm that I no longer knew the difference between peace and helping the person who was doing wrong. That was the truest thing he ever said about our marriage. I testified on the 5th day. I explained my ownership, the management agreement, my deployment, and the purpose of the limited power of attorney. The prosecutor handed me the forged deed. Is that your signature? No. Did you authorize anyone to transfer Bell Ridge? No. Did you agree to sell the farm to Aegis? No. Curtis's lawyer stood for cross-examination. Chief Whitaker, is it fair to say your brother performed most of the physical labor at Bell Ridge for decades? Yes. And you lived elsewhere? I served where the army assigned me. So he stayed and you left. I looked at Curtis. He stayed on land. My pay kept out of foreclosure. The lawyer asked whether I resented Curtis for being seen as the farmer. No. I resented him for using work he was paid to perform as permission to forge my name. He asked whether Dad had favored me. I answered carefully. My father favored accountability. Curtis experienced that as favoritism because accountability stopped him from borrowing against things he did not own. The prosecutor rested after playing the recording from Dad's voice recorder for a limited purpose related to the history of the deed. Hearing his voice in that room did not prove the forgery. The documents already did that, but it stripped away Curtis's claim that Dad had secretly intended him to own everything. Curtis chose to testify. His lawyer advised against it. Everyone could see that. Pride put him on the stand anyway. He said Bell Ridge was his life's work. He said I had become a visitor who controlled the farm through electronic transfers and legal documents. He said Dad had made a mistake and the Aegis sale was the only way to correct it. The prosecutor asked one question. If you believed the farm was morally yours, why did you need a forged deed, a false military affidavit, and service at an address your sister left 20 years ago? Curtis had no answer that survived the silence. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. They found Curtis and Marlene guilty on every major count submitted to them. Sentencing took place 6 weeks later. Before Judge Holloway announced the punishment, she allowed me to speak. I carried Dad's green notebook to the lectern, though I did not open it. I told Curtis that working the ground had mattered. I told Marlene that professional knowledge had given her a special duty not to weaponize paperwork. I told the court that the worst loss was not money. It was discovering how many ordinary dinners, phone calls, and acts of patience had been used to study my boundaries. Then I looked at Dale in the second row. Silence did not keep our family together. It only kept the truth outside long enough for the damage to grow. Before I tell you what the judge decided, answer one question in the comments. When one person must stay silent so everyone else can feel comfortable, is that peace or is it permission? Judge Holloway sentenced Curtis to a state prison term, followed by supervised release and substantial restitution. Marlene received a shorter prison term, lost her notary commission, and was barred from work involving escrow or fiduciary control. Evan received probation, community service, and restitution under his cooperation agreement. Then the judge addressed Curtis. Your sister's military service did not make her absent from her property. It made her absence useful to your plan. You treated duty as vulnerability and a courtroom as a tool for theft. Curtis looked down for the first time in the entire proceeding. The judge ordered the fraudulent deed and every related claim removed from the county record. The private lender kept its claims against Curtis and the company he had created, not against Bell Ridge. Aegis withdrew permanently. My farm was mine again on paper. Trust did not return with the title. The divorce was quieter than the criminal case. Dale did not contest the filing. He signed the property agreement, kept his repair shop, and gave up any claim connected to Bell Ridge. We sold the house near Fort Knox and divided what remained after the mortgage. Hannah helped me pack. On the last afternoon, I found the framed photograph from our 20th anniversary. Dale and I stood beside a lake, sunburned and laughing. For several minutes, I held it without knowing which box should receive it. Hannah watched from the doorway. You do not have to decide whether every memory was good or bad, she said. It happened. That can be enough for today. I wrapped the frame in newspaper and kept it. Forgiveness is often described as throwing something away. For me, it was more like accurate labeling. This was love. This was fear. This was loyalty. This was cowardice. Some years contained all four. Dale asked to meet once before the divorce became final. We sat in a diner outside Radcliffe where the coffee was strong and the booths had been repaired with silver tape. He looked older than he had at my retirement ceremony. I kept thinking I could solve everything without making anyone angry, he said. You solved it by letting them direct the anger at me. I know. Why did you help with the chain? He stared through the window. Curtis said the lockout would force you to listen to the settlement before calling a lawyer. I told myself it was one uncomfortable afternoon that would prevent years of fighting. And Dad's medal? I did not know it was in the box. When the deputy opened it, I understood that I had trusted people who wanted to humiliate you. You trusted them because their plan required less courage from you than telling me the truth. He nodded. I am not asking you to come back, he said. I finally understand that an apology is not a request for access. That sentence did not save our marriage. It did tell me he had begun learning something from its end. We signed the final papers a month later. Curtis lost his residence lease after the fraud judgment. I gave Marlene 90 days to remove their personal property from the brick house near the south pasture. Ruth told me I could have moved faster. I chose 90 days because boundaries do not need cruelty to be firm. I hired an independent farm manager named Calvin Reed, a retired army mechanic who had grown up raising cattle. The first thing he did was order a full audit. We found neglected fences, equipment listed twice, and 3 years of expenses charged to the farm that had nothing to do with farming. We also found something hopeful. Bell Ridge was healthier than Curtis had claimed. Without his private debts and Evan's company draining cash, the farm could support itself. I moved into the white farmhouse that winter. The first night, wind pressed against the old windows and the furnace clicked every few minutes. Dad's metal chair remained on the porch. His boots were still in the mudroom, hardened with age. The house felt less like a home than an evidence room where every object had a statement to make. I slept badly. The next morning, Rose climbed into my bed before sunrise and asked whether bad people could steal a farm twice. I told her people could try almost anything twice. Then how do we stop them? We keep good records, choose brave people, and never hand someone the key just because they dislike being questioned. She considered that. Can we also get a dog? That was the first practical decision of my retirement that did not require a lawyer. We adopted an elderly black Labrador named Sergeant, though he responded more reliably to Bacon. He followed Rose through every room and slept beneath Dad's desk. Little by little, Bell Ridge stopped feeling like the place where my family had betrayed me. It became the place where the truth had survived them. 1 year after the lockout, Bell Ridge Farm sounded different. The old machine shed had become a training shop for service members preparing to leave the Army. Calvin taught diesel repair. I taught inventory, purchasing, and the unglamorous skill of asking for a receipt before money disappeared. A local community college supplied instructors twice a week. The county veterans office helped people translate military experience into civilian job applications without turning every sentence into a string of abbreviations. We called the program Bell Ridge Transition Works. I did not create it because I had become saintly after retirement. I created it because empty buildings invite decay, useful work attracts useful people, and I wanted the farm's next chapter to be harder to steal than the last one. On the first Saturday in September, 12 participants and their families gathered for a harvest meal beneath the machine shed awning. Folding tables held pulled pork, cornbread, green beans, and 3 different banana puddings because no church committee can agree on one. The first image I remember from that afternoon was Calvin standing beside a young former sergeant named Luis. They had rebuilt the hydraulic system on Dad's old tractor. When the engine started, Luis grinned in a way I had not seen during his first weeks in the program. He had arrived convinced that leaving the army meant becoming unnecessary. Now he held up two greasy hands and shouted that the machine finally respected him. The second image was Hannah near the cedar trees, with Rose and Sergeant the dog. They placed small flags beside Dad's grave and the graves of two other relatives who had served. Rose had lost both front teeth and gained complete confidence in her ability to explain family history. "That is my great-grandpa," she told Luis's little boy. "He got hurt in a war, but he came home and made a farm." Then she pointed toward me. "That is my grandma. People tried to steal it, but she had notebooks." The adults laughed. I did too. There are worse legacies than being remembered for documentation. The third image came near sunset. Deputy Brooks arrived after her shift carrying the restored Purple Heart case. The metal had spent months in evidence, then several weeks with a conservator who repaired the damaged wood and replaced the missing screw. Deputy Brooks handed it to me with both hands. "Your father has completed his final tour through county custody," she said. I opened the case. The metal rested against dark blue velvet, polished but not made new. Small scratches remained along the edge. I was glad. Restoration should not pretend damage never happened. "There is something else," Deputy Brooks said. The conservator found a second layer beneath the velvet backing. Someone had glued a thin piece of cardboard over it decades ago. When he removed the damaged lining, he found a folded sheet of paper sealed inside waxed cloth. My name was written on the outside in Dad's handwriting. Nora. For a moment, the voices around me seemed to move far away. I sat in his metal porch chair and unfolded the page. The note was dated the week he transferred Bell Ridge to me. "Daughter, you will hear that I chose you because Curtis stayed and you paid. Money is part of it, but not all. You learn that taking care of a thing means knowing its condition, telling the truth about it, and leaving it ready for the next person. That is what this land needs. Do not turn the farm into a monument to me. Use it. Let children run here. Let tired people rest here. Let somebody who thinks his useful days are over discover one more job worth doing. You did not leave this family when you joined the army. You carried our name into places I never saw and still came back when I called. Home is not where a person stands every day. Home is what that person refuses to abandon." Dad had signed only "Love, Amos." I read the note twice before handing it to Hannah. She cried without trying to hide it. Rose climbed into my lap and asked whether great-grandpa knew about the training shop. "No," I said, "but I think he would recognize it." The warm twist was not that Dad had predicted the crime. He had not. It was that the future I had built out of necessity matched a hope he had hidden years before anyone tried to take the land. Curtis believed ownership meant the right to decide alone. Marlene believed documents were tools for whoever understood them best. Dale believed peace meant preventing open conflict. Dad had understood something simpler. Stewardship means telling the truth about what is in your care. That evening, we mounted the Purple Heart inside the farmhouse study, above the safe it had been stolen from. Beside it, I framed a copy of Dad's note. The original went into a bank box with the deed, the court orders, and a complete digital backup stored somewhere no relative could reach by asking my husband for a password. Old habits still die hard. Dale came to Bell Ridge once after the divorce. He asked permission first. He had completed counseling and sold his repair shop to two longtime employees. He brought Rose a small wooden toolbox he had made by hand. We spoke on the porch for 20 minutes while Sergeant slept between us. "I am glad you saved the place," he said. "I did not save it alone. No." He looked toward the machine shed, where Luis was helping another veteran load tools. "You finally chose people who did not ask you to become smaller so they could stay comfortable." That was true. Dale did not ask for forgiveness. I did not offer a reunion. We parted with kindness and a locked boundary. Evan wrote a letter during probation. He apologized without blaming his father. He enclosed a cashier's check representing the first installment of restitution from the sale of his drone equipment. I deposited it into the training program. I did not write back immediately. Accountability may open a door one day, but remorse does not choose the schedule. Marlene never contacted me. Curtis sent one message through his attorney claiming Bell Ridge would fail without him. Calvin printed the first profitable quarterly report and placed it on my desk without comment. I filed it in a blue binder. The farm did not become perfect. Fences still broke. A storm tore part of the roof from the hay barn. One participant quit after 2 weeks. Another relapsed and returned to treatment. Real restoration is not a closing scene. It is maintenance. But the mornings became ordinary again. Coffee before sunrise, Sergeant scratching at the kitchen door, Rose's backpack hanging from the same hook where Dad once kept his field jacket, young veterans arriving at the shop and signing their names beside the tools they borrowed. Every signature was a small act of trust supported by a record. For most of my life, I thought my strength came from learning how to endure difficult conditions. The Army rewarded endurance. Families often do too, especially when endurance makes everyone else's behavior easier. Retirement taught me a different kind of strength. You can love people and still remove their access. You can understand fear and still refuse its excuse. You can forgive someone and still require the door to remain locked. Keeping the peace is not the same as keeping silent. A peace that depends on one person absorbing every insult, every secret, and every consequence is not peace. It is an unpaid debt, and sooner or later someone will try to collect it from the person who owes the least. The day my family locked me out of Bell Ridge, I thought the farm was the thing I had to recover. I was wrong. The land mattered. Dad's medal mattered. The truth in the county record mattered. But the most important thing I recovered was my willingness to trust what I could plainly see, even when the people I loved preferred a softer lie. Paper is patient. It can carry a forgery for months. Truth is patient too. Given a date, a witness, and one person willing to stop calling surrender peace, truth eventually finds its way home.